The following is a Rocker Media production.
Are we growing, and how do we know that we are?
Education has to walk that tightrope.
You are not allowed to give up, ever. Teachers do not give up.
The nature of how education works.
The macro, the meso, and the micro systems.
What it means to compete, and also what it means to collaborate.
The good outcomes will follow from that.
Absolutely.
Of course it will.
We have the freedom now to be able to begin constructing, building society.
Welcome to our viewers. Today we are talking to Thebe Morake about South African education from a practitioner's perspective. Thebe is a veteran educator and educational manager as well. Currently working with the Vincent Chabalala Education Trust, among other clients, on school support and development, and especially leadership development, which I think he will share with us later. I got to know Mr. Morake about 10 years ago during our time together at Leboni College in the Northwest. So when we started there, I still remember that we were about 17, 18 educators, about 120 learners. And just an interesting stat to frame this, when we left 10 years later, it was, I think, about 900 plus learners and 75 educators from a in essence, a very small, I'm tempted to say almost a rural school to a large, effective college. I often think back to that time at Leboni for all the interesting projects we did, and also, the team spirit that we developed, the professional community of professional practitioners we managed to develop over time. I also think back fondly, Thebe, to all the times, or the conversations we had over the time. And not only the ones you and I had, also the ones that you facilitated there with your learners. And especially the thought-provoking conversations. So hence the invitation today. So with that, very, very welcome. And thank you for coming along and sharing some of your expertise.
Thank you. I think, as with everything else, I start with gratitude. I thank you for how much you respect what I think. I'm so appreciative of dialogue. And I think that the highest form of acknowledgement is to be in dialogue with like-minded people around one of the most important subject matters in South Africa. So Dr. Prins, it's good to see you, and thank you, and I look forward to this wonderful engagement. I was born and raised in Soweto. It was an amazing and an incredibly difficult time in South Africa. I was born out of an apartheid structure, which preached that a certain section of the community deserves education and the other one deserves to be in service of those in the upper class. So those two different structures, the white South Africans who had opportunity to have the highest form of education, and the black majority who were expected to be of service, created an interesting clash. And I was born out of schools which were basically inferior, which were basically constructed to make me a servant. And as a result, that colored my thinking around what education is and what is a school and what is it for. And when I was 12, I was blessed to be taken outside of the apartheid context into the United States, where also I interacted with other white Americans, but who had a very different perspective of what education ought to do. My perception of whiteness was challenged because here I am being taken seriously as a thinker by white human beings in a different context.
It's sort of breaking stereotypes for you.
Breaking stereotypes.
I'm sure I can't even imagine the sort of quite exciting, but quite challenging at the same time.
And weird.
Just weird.
Yeah, just quite weird. But I think that in terms of my philosophy around education was really, really formulated by, apartheid thinking in education, and also aspects of what progressive schools in Western Massachusetts started doing. Eaglebrook was really an interesting space which gave me the right to think more deeply, to really dig deep and learn how to speak, how to articulate my thoughts. And it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. So I sat down under a willow tree with Mr. Babcock. I remember him so fondly. And he basically taught me the structure of the English language. He said, grammar is a driver. And I began to really understand how to use grammar to articulate some of my thoughts. I speak Setswana, and also I speak English as well. So I think that in terms of background, that's really where the nature of my education came from.
No, thank you for that. I think that adds a really wonderful, what I sometimes refer to as a phenomenological approach. It's about the individual's experience of it.
Yeah.
The experiential component, which I think is such an important aspect of education for everybody, but at an individual level, but also at a group level.
Yeah.
And I love also what you said about the dialogue. I think back to a theorist with the name Baxter in America, a psychoanalyst, that defined dialogue as the simultaneousness of similarity and difference. When I listen to your personal story there with education, I hear some of that.
Yeah.
I hear the simultaneousness of the similarities that you saw, but also the difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the creative spark often comes from, isn't it? These differences. So we often look at it as a matter of conflict, which it probably is. But also within that conflict, there is the opportunity for something creative.
Absolutely.
That I find so exciting. Yeah, so sorry, I interjected there. You wanted to share.
That's part of dialogue, right? And I think that also another thing that was quite complicated was that I came from a relatively poor school to one of the richest schools in the United States. So Eaglebrook was expensive, and it was really a space where the American elite sent their kids. So language was an issue, but also class. I had never had much as a young person. I had never had my own room. I'd never had my own bed. I always slept on the floor. And here I am in this space where I have my own room. I have my own bed. I have 3 meals a day. And then I have to perform academically as well. So
it did come with a little caveat. It wasn't
absolutely
all, somebody saving Thebe from his life. There was a give and take there.
Absolutely, because they were quite clear that as much as they loved me and they deeply respected me, I had to perform as well. When I reflect on it, from an educational standpoint, I'll see it as respect. I see it as also not seeing me only as a victim, but also as a person who can get out, who's been given opportunity and who is not going to wallow in self-pity. It really, really pushed me quite hard to also want to teach. I wanted to give. And I think the best form of giving for me, I think, was really to say, what kind of impact can I make if and when I go back to South Africa?
Well, that's quite a balanced sort of view to have of it, Even as an individual that was clearly at a stage severely affected negatively to an extent by it, it's great to also explore, what it means. So a lot of my education was really, really good. Everything was functioning. Teachers turned up on time. Lots of good textbooks, lots of reading, lots of basic things. It was ideologic to a certain extent. That I had to transcend later on, obviously. Apartheid education from both perspectives came from a certain ideology. And that was not always good for the people exposed to it, I believe. And then which we all had to learn and transcend later. Which I think is why I love this country so much, is because I think that its people is just wonderful in the way that we are able to be resilient and move past that. So and we don't want others to be exactly like us. We are okay with difference. Where I see lots of spaces in the world currently where where that's clearly not the case, which is such a pity. And is that because of our education? Is that because of who we are socio-culturally? I don't know, probably a lot of, all of the above.
Yeah.
I want to take us quickly into something before we delve deeper into that, Thebe. It's from the author, prolific writer really, Yuri Bronfenbrenner. He calls this very telling title, Making Human Beings Human. Bronfenbrenner writes here, the main thesis of this volume is that, to a greater extent than for any other species, human beings create the environments that shape the course of human development. Their actions influence the multiple physical and cultural tiers of the ecology that shapes them. And this agency makes humans, for better or for worse, active producers of their own development. There's much in that, I believe, Thebe. So if you don't mind, just your initial impressions on that quote, the ideas around it. On the one hand, quite idealistic. On the other hand, quite realistic, grounded, as authors or what shall we call them, academics tend to be. Sort of bringing these two together and how you see application for that, broadly, but maybe more towards the South African education as you perceive it now.
It's a big quote. And also, what jumped out was really, what is development? What is a human being? How do we distinguish ourselves from non-humans? And I think that this capacity to think, this capacity to critically engage, this capacity to empathize, this capacity to really be moral agents, to really observe ethics, to be able to engage at that level makes us human. And I think that's a broad context. I think that what schools attempt to do is to create these human beings who are ethical, but also who can exist in a competitive environment. And I think how you manage competition.
So there is a sort of almost theoretical, abstract aspect to it, or what seems like it. Ethical, but then in the same vein also very practical, very useful, very sort of tempted to use the word industrial, but I don't like it, or post-industrial if you want to, but in South Africa maybe industrial, since we're still in that industrializing process, through the notion that you have to develop these competencies, broadly speaking, that you now have to market or sell to the market, or be employed by, build a life on. The reason I'm mentioning that, personally, I would step back from that a little bit, but that's just a personal view. But then it seems to be, if you listen to the media and you listen and you look around you, that seems to be front and center to what we mean when we say a good education, or when we say a functional education.
On one hand, there's this notion that, we are developing these human beings for education as and for what good. And I think earlier I alluded to the fact that education in a capitalist environment, education for service of capital. So for as long as you toe the line for 12 years and you basically adhere to the capitalist principles, if we think human development is about service to capital, then we need to be able to look at schools differently. To what extent do schools disrupt that notion, challenge that notion? Because there's a base and there's a superstructure. There's this top-down notion where you are driving.
There is a hierarchy built into that.
Yeah.
I mean, which we have to acknowledge.
Yeah.
It's kind of the way the world works.
Yeah.
But I don't think it should be just taken for granted and necessarily just not engaged with. I think one should.
And for me, hence this discussion.
That's the appealing part of Marx to me, as much as we can criticize him for all sorts, slightly idealistic or too humanistic or whatever you want to call it, too socialistic, I suppose. What appeals to me from what he says is exactly that he wants to, within that, for me, the individual human is not lost. It's about, to a large extent for me personally, and also why I engage with this idea, is that it tends to almost forget the development of the potential of the individual, the actualization of the self, if you will, although that's almost a bit limiting in its notion as well.
But for me, that notion of possessive individualism, right, links with this kind of capitalist ideology. You construct yourself as yourself, independent of society.
So you're saying that you're not sure if you're happy with that emphasis either.
Yeah, I'm not. And also we have to remember that Marx was responding to the excesses of that kind of individualism, right? Because I'm trying to advance my own
In his
industry.
historical context,
Exactly.
is important.
Yeah, because this kind of historical materialism notion is the fact that, the story of man is about this particular man, using other human beings as stepping stone to real advancement, and then calling it development, calling it civilization, calling it, being civilized.
So there's an exploitation there that doesn't sit well with you.
And Marx was quite clear around the fact that as much as it might push human development, there's exploitative elements of it.
Yeah.
Where apartheid-like, were quite interesting in the sense that human beings were undermined as a result of this notion. It was quite important to say, at what expense are you developing? So for me, I think that tension, that dissonance was quite important. But also, as educators, as schools, we need to be able to kind of grapple with those aspects of what it means to compete and also what it means to collaborate.
Those are two big constructs that you've touched on there, Thebe. I think there's this notion of collaboration and competition.
Yeah.
Because a good school would foster both. There is always competition, there's always this drive, and we recognize the one that comes first, second, third. But there's also an underlying notion of to the betterment of the community. Where we go one, we go all, so I've said.
There are two things. I think for me, schools do that. They walk that tightrope all the time.
Yes.
To what extent are we going to be for society? And to what extent are we going to push competition? But also, if you look at the motto, these mottos are always about oneness and community building. So it's almost like a contradiction. And I think part of education is about setting intention with that kind of contradiction. But also very good teaching kind of places that, profiles it and says, well, let's look at this aspect. So as a history teacher, I used to teach, that history is really about a story of those who won, right? Because they are in a privileged position to be able to kind of dictate terms.
History is the history of the victor.
Of course. And then also, but those who are losing have to be able to also respond to the extent to which they've been erased from history.
Yeah.
They're not part of human dialogue. Like if you look at the African continent, some of the kind of condescending notions around Africa is that nothing comes out of Africa. Nothing new comes from Africa. And then that condescension is as a result of this notion that those who've colonized, those who've won, basically won at the expense of erasing the existence of other people. And then I think that education has to walk that tightrope.
And South African, quite a melting pot of that.
Yes, exactly.
Think about it.
Yeah.
It's this very intense microcosm.
Yeah.
So no wonder we live with all these different questions and tensions in the South African education system.
Yeah.
There's that quote of Bronfenbrenner, which really is about exactly what we discussed, individual agency, but in the group context, and the idea of freedom and responsibility is also wrapped up in human agency, in that idea.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious that he elaborated. He's got quite a wide, well-known system. So I just want to unpack a little bit of that, and then let us apply, some of those ideas as you might find it applicable, to specifically South African education system, its challenges, and possibly, I believe, lots of opportunities for development. The theory then tries to organize what might be called the social context, or some psychologists refer to the field in which humans live and develop. And it categorizes it into the macro, the meso, and the micro systems. He also speaks about a temporal aspect, or the chronos system, which is how these systems evolve and develop over time, which is equally interesting. I know you're also a historian, Thebe. I know you as a historian, so you might enjoy that aspect. Diagrammatically, it forms a concentric model. consisting, if you will, of three circles. With the outer biggest circle referring to the macro system factors, then in the middle circle, it representing the mesosystem factors, and then the factors closest or most proximal to the learner or the individual that's being analyzed through this lens, the person, referring to the microsystem. So I would be an individual with a family around me, which would be my microsystem. Of course, in education, it becomes very interesting. There is merit in viewing the classroom also and the individual teacher as such a microsystem within the meso, which is the school and the community.
Yeah.
More traditionally, I would say we would place the community at a meso level and the school at a micro level. Of course, in the center of this circle, we might place the developmental or developing human. And then these different factors are placed either closer, or we might say proximal, in Bronfenbrenner's words, to the center or further away, which he refers to as distal factors. To the developing person, in the case of education, we can refer to the developing person, and also an interesting notion in South Africa that we, in my view, classify people according to function a little bit when we say learner. So you're not a developing child, you're a learner, which I don't have too much of a problem with, but it's an interesting thought that at one point, I remember when I was at school, I was referred to as a child, the children. Teachers readily spoke about the children. Now we are encouraged to use the term learner. So I don't know if there's anything in that except maybe just policy changes. But it's interesting that we we made that a difference. So people that have lived longer, younger people will find it quite normal and natural to refer to learners at school as learners and not children. But like I said, you and I must have had, I don't know for you, but I had a different experience in terms of that. Okay, so the basic idea being then of Bronfenbrenner then, that the more proximal factors have a more direct and significant influence or impact on the development of the person, right? So the most proximal would be the mother and the father, or a significant adult. Of course, once again, interesting in South Africa, many child-led households, with an older sibling playing that role. Which would then be the most proximal factor.
It speaks to my two boys. I have an 8-year-old and I have a 12-year-old. I'm quite educated, and my wife is as well.
Yes.
And we are privileged enough to be able to do homework with our kids, to sit with them and to read with them, and also to do numeracy with them, to be able to expose them to people, professionals, tutors outside of school. To be able to expose them to spaces, geographical spaces outside of school. So when they walk into a classroom context, they're already enriched. And also they are ahead, in a sense, because they're already coming into a classroom already ahead.
I love that you mentioned that, because it's Alle Bronfenbrenner is speaking about all these different factors and system factors, and it all sounds very academical, but you're making it very practical actually for us here. In your exposition and your sharing of your personal story, as well as how you educate your own children. And you're pointing to a very important, almost invisible factor, system-wise, often invisible or not accounted for. The role of the parent and the primary household, and which I think we do know and acknowledge at quite an instinctive level. Everybody knows this, but I wonder if we acknowledge this enough. And
we need to write more about it, because what ends up happening is that your middle class kids walk into school with a bigger vocabulary than the kids who don't come from that environment.
A la Dewey.
Absolutely.
I'm referring to the educational philosopher and writer, prolific writer, American writer, John Dewey, who said, experience is our greatest teacher. And these kids have a different experience. And therefore a better vocabulary, or a broader vocabulary, if you don't like the notion of better, but broader, more able to express themselves. And just by your own account earlier, how you got exposed and then got challenged to expand, in essence, what one might call your subjective world got expanded by that challenge.
Yes. When you exist in that ecosystem,
Yeah.
you start taking things for granted. And I'll use a practical example around swimming. My boys learn how to swim since we were at Lebone 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So they're quite strong now. So it's not, there's nothing special in a sense around them, their genetic whatever. They've been in this pool for many more hours than the kids in their classroom at school. So when they do a swimming test at their school,
Yeah.
they're able to swim from one side to the other. Now, other people in different systems would overreact to that and say, these black kids can swim so well. And I'm saying, no, these black kids have been swimming for a long time, longer than you.
Yeah.
So there's nothing intrinsic, there's nothing different. So what ends up happening is that because of the exposure to swimming, to the number of hours, now they're beginning to get the benefits of that.
Yeah.
They're ahead. Reading, the same thing.
Yeah.
So reading is about sharing vocabulary, also sharing enunciation and pronunciation of words. And numeracy is about being quite comfortable with numbers over time, over a longer time. So you now place them within the context with other kids who haven't had that kind of exposure.
Yeah.
Then somehow they will get that necessary advantage.
You're referring to quantity, how many hours.
Yeah.
I think that's an important aspect, but also the quality of the experience.
Yes.
How it was for them when they got exposed to it.
And also when they walk into a classroom, they've heard it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times.
And we learn through repetition. We know this.
Exactly.
Learning theory teaches us this.
That's to now contextualize differences in performances in classroom, right? And also it contextualizes another system in the classroom, the way South African teachers look at education and the way South African parents look at schools. Yes. I look at schools in my house. My house is my school. Whereas my friend would think the school is just where they learn stuff. I'm saying, no. They walk into a classroom ready to go.
You have a more holistic sense of what education means.
Yes.
Education for you means much more than I go to school where some teacher will show me how to read and write. Yes, it's that, but it's way broader than that.
And I look at a lot of ratios, right? There are 30 of them in a classroom. At home, what's the ratio? 2 to 1?
Yeah.
Or 3 to 1, depending on the number?
Way better.
Way better. So why don't you cultivate that space to make it so that when they walk into a classroom where the ratio is 1 to 25, they're not hiding or they're not lost.
It also plays into this notion of teacher and educator. Because for me, educator is it's much broader. And parents as educators, not necessarily trained teachers per se, and probably nor do you have to be.
Yeah.
But just showing a natural interest in your child and what they are interested in and exposing them will already, put you on the front foot, I believe.
It does. And I think for me, you ask about what I've picked up about South African education in terms of perception is that a lot of parents in South Africa look at schools as their own kids as these empty vessels that are going into schools to be taught something.
Yes.
Yeah, and they pay for it. Right?
Yeah.
So we're paying you to deposit stuff.
Yeah.
A la Freire, right?
Yeah.
Deposit. So if you don't...
Yeah, banking notion of education from Paulo Freire.
Yeah. So when you don't deposit, then the school is bad. You deposit in your own house, and then allow school to really do its business. Also having a mutual relationship with your family structure. And I think that for me, it's a uniquely South African thing that I've seen in my 15, 18 years in classroom. Because I used to ask questions. I used to ask kids, how is it possible that you're doing so well? Because we celebrate excellent performances at grade 10. One of the students one time said to me, sir, I know and I appreciate the fact that you're celebrating me, but I've been doing this for 10 years. So you're only picking it up towards the tail end. You don't know how I started. This was on purpose and this was designed.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm reaping these benefits.
The outcome is the outcome of a process.
Yes.
And I think this goes to another notion that I often pick up on in, wherever it makes sense to refer to this. In South Africa, we tend to love the outcome. We even had outcomes-based education, which I'm not totally against. I think there's some value to it. It's just for me, the logic of outcomes-based education was quite sort of seductive. The logic of it for me was definitely, as a young teacher, seductive, that you can work towards this and be clear about it. And clarity is often useful. But then there's also an arrogance there, that we assume that these would be the outcomes. Without speaking much to the process, we seem to be quite... I don't think that we really are blind to the process. It just often remains unacknowledged. That we have this, it's more about the process really. And then, of course, if it's a strong, high quality, and in your words also the quantity of this process is strong and good, the outcomes will also, the good outcomes will follow from that.
Absolutely.
Of course it will.
And purely because of time on task, right?
Yeah.
The amount of time you spend on task will absolutely benefit you. This notion of 1,000 hours. So why I share that anecdote is just to also make you aware of the fact that is it a class thing that I'm doing, or is it just understanding the nature of how education works? Because I don't think that it's a byproduct of only the elites or those who've been in school. I think for me, any time you spend time on something, that it yields benefit. In our communities, we have a mixture. We have mixed groups. So dialogue with their cousins when we have to have these family meetings. It's December when we have to meet. Now you see this thing profiled. You see all these experiences.
So you're sitting quite comfortably where you are and it's all good. But once you go into a different context, you decontextualize and you recontextualize in that process.
And you see what has happened over the last 11 months. You see progress. And you see, in other instances, you see people who haven't progressed. And you see...
Or progress is minimal.
Or that's when different systems interact. In those family meetings in December. And that makes me think a lot of John Hattie's work, educational, where he said, everything we do in education works. I'm not sure if I would completely or wholeheartedly support that. Certainly some things that you do, like violence in schools, doesn't work. But everything we do intentionally in education tend to have some effect or impact. But to have positive impact, there's very particular things that he feels one need to do. I think going back to Lebone, I think some of our longest discussions and debates were about what Hattie was communicating around. How do we know that we're growing, right?
I think that's his underlying question. Is sort of, are we growing, and how do we know that we are? I mean, it's maybe a gross oversimplification of a very complex work, but a quantitative researcher of note. I love his work. I think it's got so much to offer, but it has to be contextualized for South Africa, of course.
And for me, we pulled it here in South Africa. I think for me, I've had to use it to be able to kind of understand differences in performances in schools. What accounts for it, actually. Because if you do your research, a gentleman at Harvard University also, his name is Roland Fry, who did a study on why schools perform. And he made some very important point about the importance of tutoring. The notion that you have to spend more time with work. You have to be able to evaluate your data when you assess. What are you assessing for? And once you've figured out what has happened within that assessment, what do you do with that data? Do you move on if students have not done well, or do you reteach it?
This sort of notion that we're reporting for reporting's sake sometimes.
Exactly.
So now we've reported, it's all done now we move on. Instead of really leveraging that feedback, if you will.
So good schools leverage the feedback. Leverage what we do with our data. So that they can do it again if they failed. And as a result, it across class, that model works. And so that's the big one. But also this tutoring. I think this notion of tutoring...
It speaks to the proximal factors that I was alluding to earlier.
Exactly.
Because it is, it points to that what you're calling tutoring, and we've had parenting, or good quality parenting, as a micro factor. Or a proximal factor in terms of facilitating development.
So, for example, regularly kids have 5 hours of mathematics a week. Many of the kind of outliers would have 10 hours of math a week. Mm-hmm. You see, because they have a tutor after school every day. If you now give more time to it, they grasp it, they practice it, and then they go back into a classroom tomorrow again and do it better.
Of what used to be called at one point competency-based learning, where it's this notion that, I don't know if it's completely true, but it's an interesting notion. Everybody can achieve just about anything at an 80%, 90% level. Doesn't matter the human, but the big variable in that will be time. Well, it'll take some 2 hours, others 4, others 6, others will take probably 15 to achieve a very similar outcome. Which I think for me, there's a positive notion in that, that you can sort of work towards something if you're dedicated. Clashes a little bit with this idea of sometimes natural talent. I think it's always a balance between the two. So like, take your children and the swimming, for instance. So they got noticed because they're good swimmers, and because of people's stereotypes, it was kind of interesting to them. They noticed it. It stood out. But now, would they be necessarily now Olympic champions?
No.
We don't know yet. They need to compete and see.
And also another factor, which going back to the South African context, also in terms of looking at development, what accounts for it is the quality of the teacher.
Also part of these proximal factors.
Absolutely.
The individual teacher.
Yes.
The importance of the individual teacher, the impact an individual teacher can make. That goes possibly what would be considered a little bit above and beyond. Whether it really is or not, so in other contexts, I've been always saying that, teachers are never allowed to give up. That's the challenge of any teacher. You are not allowed to give up, ever. Teachers do not give up, and they always believe that there's more to explore.
Primary school level also, what I really was quite surprised to find is that you have one teacher per 30 students for 3 years, from grade 1 to grade 3. And for me, if you get it wrong and you don't get a very good teacher, then you have 3 years of damage. That has not been, estimated or assessed, because also...
So there's two sides to this.
Because primary school teachers are not experts, they are generalists. So they basically can have a sense of many things, but they're not experts. So what are the consequences?
Shouldn't they be expert in the developmental, for lack of a better term, developmental psychology, but also personal development of the children in their care?
Yes.
And many are, I believe. I believe many are.
But I think in South Africa we're struggling with the quality.
Aspect.
With that aspect. Because many of them are not. And also they don't do differentiation as well. They kind of lean a little bit too much into the kids who are coming in already prepared. When friends ask me about different schools, I say schools are very clever in the sense that they respond to what parents have already done. And then they say, we've done well. And I think primary school profiles that. Because it's at the beginning stages of their educational development. And many poor teachers, in very good schools too, kind of lean into the kids who are already coming in prepared.
So you're taking us a little bit to the meso level that we referred to earlier. The community.
The community,
and the neighborhood community. Dare we say province, obviously it expands.
And then for me, a lot of credit is given to people who are not doing much, who are basically riding on what parents have already put into kids. And you pick it up by the level of differentiation in classrooms.
Or to flip the script on it a little bit, maybe lamenting what the parents haven't done. And saying, okay, but we can't do much about this. Which in some sense might be true, because there's only so much a teacher can do in the hours given the 40 in the classroom, 50 in the classroom.
The numbers argument does exist, but also the quality of delivery needs to be critically engaged with. There are some teachers who are very good with 60.
Yes.
And who have done exceptional work in developing that model, which they picked up from China, right?
But they teach differently to 60 than they would to 30, that they would to 15.
Some of them don't.
Okay.
Some of them don't, and that's where we saw the concern when we did professional development in some of the schools, is that they don't change the way they teach based on numbers. They don't make those adjustments. And I think when we did those experiments, one who does well at 60, you give them 10, they don't know what to do.
Interesting.
And I think, so for me, it's a larger debate, but I think in terms of what I picked up about, highly selective schools, they select the best so that they can say they're the best. And I think it's like Harvard University. Harvard better do well every year because they only take the best of the best, the best of the best all over the world. The most selective school in the world, they better have the highest results in the world.
I think we've really managed to go quite deeply into the micro and the meso aspects. I think one part we haven't really explored is the macro aspect, but maybe it sort of speaks for itself. I want us to really work with three aspects, and I'll put them down for us. So one interesting question I have is whether we can describe the South African educational system as effective and functional. That's the one aspect. Now, and we can debate that.
Yeah.
Flowing from that, it seems a step too far to speak of a dysfunction. Yet clearly there are challenges. So maybe that will come up as part of the response to the question. And then, I want us to leave it really on a positive note where we speak about, what might be some creative ideas for improving South African education. Ideas you think is worth exploring or just thinking about.
Number one, I look at timelines and I look at how old we are as a country. And I think that one of the concerns I do have is that we are a bit hard on ourselves. South Africans are notoriously hard on themselves because we want to get to the stage where, we are better at what we do. We research a lot. We have these discussions. We debate. And I think, number one, I just need to be able to caution around the fact that we're only less than 30 years old. We are in experimental mode. And I think that if you look at the course of history, there are some schools which are 124 years old. There are schools in South Africa which
steeped in tradition.
Steeped in tradition. And
which might be functional or also dysfunctional in some respects.
Absolutely. So we are in that space where we are a nation in the making in terms of the trajectory of history. We are very, very young. We need to calm down a bit. And we need to be able to praise the fact that we can be critical of government. We can engage our Minister of Education.
And I think that's fair comment.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a positive for me. Absolutely. And we spoke about dialogue earlier.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think that's it's very difficult to pin down, what makes a South African, different people, different things. But for me, if there is a generalization to be had, I think we don't mind true dialogue, which isn't as innocent as it looks. Because it is these disparate sort of conversations. There's a tension in that from which something new and creative can emerge.
Yeah.
It can also go terribly wrong. But I think as South Africans, when we say we have a robust debate, that is what we do.
It's a positive. I think one person said that dialogue is the lifeblood of democracy. For schools.
Yeah.
To be able to define where South Africa goes, because there's this massive debate: do schools reflect society? To what extent do schools kind of influence society? And also in terms of people in parliament, where did they go to school? How did the schools influence them? And I was lucky to teach some of the young people who are in parliament now.
Sure.
And part of what I used to encourage them to do, especially the privileged ones, is to be able to say, how do you use your privilege in an evolving South Africa, which is not perfect?
Yeah.
And how do we create, just to use an American term, a more perfect union? But it's now more of an aspirational part of what we attempt to do.
Democracy is always aspirational by its very nature. It's never the perfect democracy. But there is that aspiration towards a more cohesive whole.
Yeah.
A functional whole.
And that's also when people talk about democratizing education, it is the fact that we need to be able to be open to other people totally contradicting what we fight for every day and being okay with it. This is not lost on us, the fact that a black South African and a white South African brothers, we are in dialogue.
Absolutely.
Around what's best for our country.
Yes.
And we will fight, we will disagree, as we always did. And that's why we sharpened each other thinking quite a bit at Lebone. And also Lebone as a model, because not many people get to begin a school from scratch.
Yeah.
And a school which now is running well.
Yeah.
No school is perfect, but the fact that Lebone is running well speaks to the routes concept. With us, we establish strong roots. We are debating robustly. We are changing. That's the nature of being young and immature, but not unwilling to learn. We are in diverse spaces. Independent schools are welcoming different types of kids in their schools. Neurodiverse kids, really talented kids.
It needs to be an open system. So, from certain perspectives, analyzing, let's say, something relevant like apartheid education, however you want to define it, and even apartheid as a system, people would say, the reason it died, theoretically, is many, but entropy. It's a closed system. It's sort of a self-fulfilling, self-destroying system. And so, looking at a school as a system like that, schools cannot remain closed and a force unto themselves.
We have been very, very good in deconstructing the problems that apartheid has created. We have the freedom now to be able to begin constructing, building a society that also begins to challenge us. What does it mean? I mean, I use the notion, if you're raised with this notion that we don't like those people, we don't like homosexuals, we don't like black people, we don't like white people, and you walk into a classroom and you're taught by a gay man or a black person or a white person, how do you respond?
It will confront you with your own stereotypes.
With negative perceptions about difference, right?
Yeah.
How does that affect how you mark, right? How does that affect how you profile those people? How does that affect the selection lists in water polo? How does that affect assessment, and how does it affect evaluation?
Yeah.
And how does it affect even the perception of a school? Are we going to develop? And what are the signs that we are developing? And also, are we able to recognize those particular signs? Antonio Gramsci said this Italian thinker and philosopher: pursue the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. Yes, you have to unpack things as they are.
Yes.
You need to be able to open up. You need to see life as it is, but also develop a way of engaging with that kind of transition with a level of optimism. The fact that we can disagree robustly and then absolutely...
And still be okay.
And sit
not
here.
Have it blow up in a massive conflict necessarily.
Absolutely.
Just because we engage with something that is quite close and quite important.
Yeah.
Because I think, and maybe we'll draw it to a close there, Thebe. Thank you for all your contributions. It's such a pleasure to talk and learn from you and with you in the conversation, as always. It's been thought-provoking, as I sort of alluded to in the beginning.
Yeah.
It's definitely thought-provoking, and there's so much more to explore.
Yeah.
But I think let's keep talking. Let's not end the debate there.
Absolutely. I thank you so much, Dr. Prins. Deep respect for you. And I look forward to continuing this dialogue.